The moment I heard the screeching tires and the sickening crunch of metal, I knew my brother David had done it again. I was sitting at my desk, going through some paperwork for my law practice when the phone rang. It was a local news alert about a drunk driving accident. My heart sank as I recognized the address. It was David's favorite bar. As the family's go-to lawyer, I had been prepared for this, but nothing could prepare me for the fact that he was once again in trouble. This time it wasn't just a minor fender bender. It was serious. He had crashed into another car, injuring 2 people and totaling his vehicle. My parents were going to expect me to swoop in and save him just like I always had. But this time felt different. I couldn't bear the thought of sacrificing my career for his reckless behavior any longer. I had spent years bailing him out of trouble, and each time, it chipped away at my self-respect. When I heard the sirens wailing in the distance, I felt a mix of anger and dread. I had always been there to pick up the pieces, but this time I was determined to let him face the music. With the family gathering for the holidays in just 2 weeks, the urgency to take a stand was pressing. I could already envision the conversations around the dinner table, the expectant looks from my parents as they casually mentioned how I would handle his case, as if it were an expected family duty. But I was done. I had played the role of the dutiful daughter and sister for far too long. The weight of their expectations felt suffocating, and I knew that if I didn't act now, I'd be trapped in this cycle of enabling him forever. Could I really do it? Could I really tell my family that enough was enough? It had always been clear. David was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes. Growing up, he was showered with praise while I learned to take a back seat, always the supportive sister. I was the one who made the grades, who put in the hard work, yet somehow it was never enough. My parents' favoritism was so blatant that it felt like a slap in the face every time they bragged about him. I had spent years supporting him, and it became a pattern that I couldn't shake off. When he needed money for his latest scheme, I was the one who loaned him cash, convinced that he would turn things around. When he got into a bind, I was the one who paid for his legal troubles, hoping that this time would be the last. I remember one instance when he needed help with a DUI charge. I hired a lawyer for him, spent hours negotiating, and in the end he walked away with a slap on the wrist. My parents praised him for his charm, completely oblivious to how I had bent over backward to save him. Every time I bailed him out, it felt like I was investing in a sinking ship. My efforts were treated like obligations, and my sacrifices were never acknowledged. I found myself working late nights to keep my practice afloat, while David lounged on the couch, expecting me to be his safety net. It was infuriating to see how he took my support for granted, never once considering the toll it took on me. As the holiday approached, they casually mentioned how I would be handling his case, as if it were an expected family duty. "Rachel, we know you can fix this. You're always so good at these things," they said, their tone dripping with expectation. It made my skin crawl. I felt like a puppet, and they were pulling the strings. The pressure to comply was building, and with each passing day, I felt the weight of their expectations suffocating me. I tried to speak up, to express how exhausted I was from being the family's problem solver, but my words fell on deaf ears. My parents would brush me off, insisting that family should always come first. The idea that my well-being mattered less than David's mistakes made me sick. I was trapped in this role that I never chose, and the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. David, with his easy charm, continued to manipulate our parents, playing the victim while I was left to pick up the pieces. I remember a day when I overheard my mother on the phone with a friend, discussing how wonderful and talented David was, and how lucky I was to have such a brother. It felt like a punch to the gut. I had always been there for him, but I was just an afterthought in their eyes. The more I tried to be strong, the more they pushed back. They expected me to take on the burden of his mistakes, while they remained blissfully ignorant of the damage it was doing to me. I felt like I was drowning in their expectations. I couldn't let this continue. I had to find a way to break free from this toxic cycle, but how? As I prepared for the family gathering, I realized that it was now or never. I needed to make a stand, to finally say enough was enough. The thought of facing them filled me with dread, but I couldn't allow myself to go back to being the doormat. I had worked too hard for my own success. It was time to demand respect for the sacrifices I had made. I could already envision the conversations around the dinner table, the expectant looks from my parents as they casually mentioned how I would handle David's case. But I was done. I wanted to be free from the chains of their expectations, free from the guilt of not being who they wanted me to be. It was time to reclaim my life. But could I really do it? Could I really tell my family that enough was enough? The news hit me like a freight train. David's drunk driving had led to a serious accident, and now he was facing potential jail time. I had been at my office going through some paperwork when my phone buzzed with an alert. It was a breaking news update about a car accident involving a drunk driver. My heart dropped as I read the location. It was right by his favorite bar. I didn't even need to look further to know it was David. When he called me, slurring his words and begging me to get him out of this mess, I felt my blood boil. I had been bracing myself for this moment for years, but nothing could prepare me for the sheer audacity of his request. "Rachel, you have to help me. I can't go to jail," he cried. He laughed about the accident, as if it was just a minor inconvenience, but I felt sick to my stomach. This was serious. He had crashed into another car, injuring 2 people and totaling his vehicle. As I listened to him plead, I stumbled upon a text message from my parents, discussing how I would handle everything for him. It was as if my career was merely a tool for his convenience. They saw me as the family lawyer, the one who could save him from his own stupidity. At that moment I realized how disposable I had become in their eyes. I was not just tired of being the family's go-to problem solver. I was furious. I couldn't believe I had let this go on for so long. I took a deep breath, fighting back my anger. How could I have allowed this pattern to continue? David had gotten away with so much over the years, and I was the one left to pick up the pieces. It was time to change the narrative. There was no going back. I had to take a stand. I had to let him face the consequences of his actions, no matter how hard it was to do. I hung up the phone and sat in silence, my mind racing. The familiar urge to jump in and save him was strong, but I pushed it aside. I thought about all the sacrifices I had made for him, and how they went unrecognized. Each time I bailed him out, I felt a piece of myself slip away. This time I refused to be his safety net. I needed to reclaim my life and my career. But the thought of confronting my family filled me with dread. I knew they would expect me to support David, to come to his rescue as I always had. They would see me as the bad guy for not helping him, and the guilt would weigh heavily on me. But I also realized that their guilt was not my burden to carry. If I didn't stand up for myself now, I would be trapped in this cycle forever. I spent the next few days wrestling with my decision, contemplating how I would approach the conversation with my family. I couldn't let them manipulate me into thinking I had to do something I didn't want to do. The more I thought about it, the more resolute I became. I had to set boundaries and make it clear that David needed to take responsibility for his actions. It was time for him to learn that his choices had consequences, and I wouldn't be there to shield him anymore. As the holiday gathering approached, I felt a mix of anxiety and anticipation. I knew this would be the moment of truth. I could already imagine the looks on my parents' faces when I told them I wouldn't represent David. I could hear their voices in my head, pleading for me to reconsider, but I had to stay strong. I had to remind myself that my well-being mattered too. This was my chance to break free from the suffocating expectations placed upon me for years. I had spent too long being the dutiful daughter and sister, sacrificing my own happiness to keep the peace. I could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on me, but I was determined to rise above it. It was time for my voice to be heard, and I was ready to take a stand. I pictured the family dinner, the tension in the air as I announced my decision. I could already hear the protests from my parents, the disappointment in their voices. But I reminded myself that I was doing this for my own sake, to reclaim my life and my choices. Once I set my mind to it, I knew I couldn't back down. I was ready to face the fallout. I had to make it clear that I would no longer be a pawn in their game, and I was prepared for the backlash. David had to learn that he was not invincible, and I was finally ready to let him face the consequences. This was it. I was done being the family's problem solver. I was ready to step into my own power, and I wouldn't let anyone take that away from me any longer. I decided it was time to confront my family. It was the night before the family gathering, and I could feel the tension bubbling beneath the surface. I had rehearsed my words over and over in my head, but the thought of actually saying them made my stomach churn. I knew I had to lay out my boundaries clearly, and I had to be firm. I couldn't let them manipulate me into thinking I had to come to David's rescue again. At dinner, with my parents and David gathered around the table, I took a deep breath. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken expectations, and I could almost feel the weight of their gazes on me as I prepared to speak. I will not represent David in this case, I said, my voice steady but firm. He needs to face the consequences of his actions. The moment the words left my mouth, the room went silent. My parents looked at me as if I had just committed a crime. I could see the disbelief in their eyes, and I felt a rush of adrenaline. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. But Rachel, he's your brother. You can't just abandon him. My mother exclaimed, her voice rising in pitch. She leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if she needed something to hold on to. I met her gaze without flinching. This isn't about abandoning him. It's about him learning responsibility. If he wants help, he needs to seek it elsewhere. Their dismissive attitudes only fueled my resolve. I could see David's face turning from shock to anger as the reality of my decision sunk in. He opened his mouth to protest, but I held up my hand, cutting him off. You had your fun, David. You put yourself in this situation, and now it's time to deal with the fallout. I won't be your crutch anymore. The tension in the room escalated, and I could feel the heat radiating from my parents as they started to challenge my decision. My dad, usually the calm one, leaned back in his chair with a frown. Rachel, you're being unreasonable. David needs you now more than ever. You can't just walk away from your family. I took a deep breath, trying to remain composed. I am walking away from the role you've assigned me. I'm not going to be the family lawyer who cleans up David's messes anymore. It's time for him to face what he's done. David's expression shifted from anger to desperation. Come on, Rach. You're my sister. You wouldn't really let me go to jail over this, would you? His voice dripped with manipulation and I felt my blood boil. This isn't about being a good sister. This is about doing the right thing for both of us. You need to learn that your actions have consequences, and I won't be there to shield you from them. They tried to counter my arguments, but I could see the frustration etched on their faces. They were accustomed to me being the reliable one, the one who would always step up when David got into trouble. But I was done playing that role. I was tired of being the family's problem solver while my own needs went ignored. As the conversation continued, I felt a sense of empowerment rising within me. I was finally standing up for myself and it felt liberating. I could see the shock in their expressions, and I knew that this was not what they were expecting. The more they pushed back, the more resolute I became. I wouldn't back down. I had spent too long being the dutiful daughter and sister, sacrificing my own happiness to keep the peace. I realized that their guilt was not my burden to carry. If they wanted David to learn responsibility, they needed to let him face the consequences of his actions. As the night wore on, I could feel the atmosphere shifting. My parents, used to having control over me, were struggling to understand why I was refusing to comply. They were used to me being the obedient daughter who did what was expected of her. But this time I was ready to break free from their expectations. I held my ground, refusing to let their words sway me. I knew that if I didn't stand up for myself now, I would be trapped in this cycle forever. I was reclaiming my life, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me. In that moment, I felt a wave of clarity wash over me. I was finally taking a stand and it was exhilarating. I could see the confusion on my parents' faces, but I didn't care. I was done being their puppet. It was time for David to learn that he couldn't rely on me anymore. As I looked around the table, I felt a sense of relief. I was finally saying what needed to be said, and it was liberating. I was ready to face the backlash, but I knew deep down that this was the right decision. I was reclaiming my life and it felt good. As the date of the family gathering drew closer, my parents ramped up their attempts to manipulate me. If you don't help David, he might go to jail. What kind of sister would let that happen? They insisted, their guilt-tripping tactics making my skin crawl. I could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on me, suffocating me. They downplayed my concerns, insisting it was just this one time and that family should always come first. It was infuriating to hear them dismiss my feelings while they only cared about their own comfort. The thought of being the bad guy loomed over me, making me question my resolve. I felt torn between my desire to break free from their toxic expectations and the fear of being labeled the selfish one. My parents were skilled at playing on my guilt, and I knew they would stop at nothing to make me feel responsible for David's future. My mom had this way of twisting the narrative, saying things like, "Rachel, we're just worried about David. He's made mistakes, and it's up to you to help him. He's your brother." I could hear her voice echoing in my head, each word like a dagger aimed at my conscience. It was as if my entire identity hinged on my willingness to sacrifice for him, to clean up after his messes. They couldn't see that I was exhausted, that their relentless pressure was draining me. I had spent years absorbing the fallout from David's reckless behavior, and now I was supposed to jump in once again, as if all my hard work and sacrifices didn't matter. The anger bubbled inside me, and I felt a surge of defiance. I started to write down my thoughts, trying to solidify my resolve. I needed to remind myself why I was doing this. I had worked hard to establish my career as a lawyer, and I refused to let my brother's mistakes derail my life any longer. The more I reflected, the clearer it became. I was not responsible for his choices. As the holiday approached, the pressure intensified. My parents casually mentioned how I would be handling his case, as if it were an expected family duty. "Rachel, we know you can fix this. You're always so good at these things," they said with a tone that made my skin crawl. It was infuriating to feel like a puppet, and they were pulling the strings. I remember a moment when my dad cornered me in the living room, his voice low and serious. "Rachel, we need you to step up. David is in trouble, and he needs his sister to help him through this. What will people think if you don't?" It was a classic guilt trip, and for a moment I felt my resolve wavering. But then I reminded myself of everything I had endured to keep this family together, only to be met with indifference. I tried to express my feelings, to tell them how exhausted I was from being the family's problem solver, but my words fell on deaf ears. My parents would brush me off, insisting that family should always come first. The idea that my well-being mattered less than David's mistakes made me sick. I felt trapped in this role that I never chose, and the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. I had always been there for David, but it felt like I was investing in a sinking ship. Every time I bailed him out, it felt like I was throwing my hard-earned money into a black hole. My sacrifices were met with apathy, and my parents' favoritism towards him was glaringly obvious. I could feel the resentment building inside me, and the thought of facing them at the family gathering made my stomach churn. As I prepared for the inevitable confrontation, I felt a mix of anxiety and determination. I had to make it clear that I would not be a pawn in their game any longer. I was ready to face the fallout, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. The closer the gathering got, the more I envisioned the conversations around the dinner table. My parents would expect me to handle everything, to jump in and save David as I always had. But this time I was done. I was ready to reclaim my life and say enough was enough. I would not allow their manipulation to dictate my choices any longer. I had spent too long being the dutiful daughter and sister, sacrificing my own happiness to keep the peace. The time had come for me to stand my ground. I was determined to break free from their toxic expectations and finally prioritize my own needs. As I steeled myself for the confrontation, I couldn't help but feel a sense of empowerment rising within me. I was ready to take a stand, and there was no turning back. The family holiday gathering arrived, and the tension in the air was palpable as everyone took their seats around the dinner table. David showed up late, and my parents immediately flocked to him, their concern almost suffocating. They asked about the accident, treating it like an unfortunate inconvenience rather than the serious matter it was. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting for me to jump in and rescue him just like I always had. As the conversation flowed, David made a joke about how I could easily get him out of this mess. Laughter erupted from the table, but I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. This was the moment they expected me to fold, to step in and play the role of the dutiful sister. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that I had to stay strong this time. When my parents pressed me to intervene, I shook my head firmly. "No, I won't help him this time," I said, my voice steady. I could see the shock and anger flash across David's face, and the laughter faded into an uncomfortable silence. My refusal to support him hung heavy in the air, and I could feel the tension rising as my parents exchanged worried glances. David's bravado crumbled as he realized he had no backup. He shot me a desperate look, but I remained silent, determined not to give in. The silence was deafening. I watched as my parents struggled to defend him without my legal expertise, their attempts falling flat. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment I could finally break free from the role they had assigned me. As the dinner progressed, David's attempts to deflect attention with humor backfired. My parents seemed to grow more frustrated with each passing minute. When my uncle pointed out the flaws in David's excuses, it was clear to everyone that he was out of his depth without my help. I felt a sense of liberation wash over me. I was no longer the family's problem solver. I was done being the one who cleaned up David's messes. As I sat back and let the chaos unfold, I realized that I was finally reclaiming my power. My family's expectations no longer held me captive. I was free. The atmosphere shifted. My parents, used to having control over my actions, were unprepared for my resistance. They were visibly annoyed and confused. My mother's frustration boiled over. "You should be ashamed of yourself for not helping him," she shouted, her voice filled with anger. But I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. I had finally stood my ground, and their outrage only highlighted their own insecurities. David, without my support, was failing to navigate the fallout of his actions. I realized then that I didn't have to defend myself. Their reactions spoke volumes about our family dynamic. As the evening wore on, the realization that I no longer had to bear this burden settled in. I had spent years being the one to fix things, but now I was free to focus on myself. I felt lighter, and for the first time in a long time I was at peace. I was no longer defined by my family's expectations or David's mistakes. I watched the chaos unfold, and instead of feeling guilty, I felt empowered. I was finally taking a stand, and it felt good. I was reclaiming my life, and I wouldn't let anyone take that away from me. Instead of jumping to his defense, I simply sat back, allowing the chaos to unfold. When my parents pressed me to intervene, I shook my head, saying nothing. I watched as David's bravado crumbled under the weight of the conversations around him. They expected me to bail him out, but I refused to play my role. The silence that followed my refusal was deafening. David's face turned red with embarrassment as he realized he had no backup. The laughter faded, and tension filled the room as my parents struggled to defend him without my legal expertise. It was surreal watching my brother squirm. He had always been the golden boy in our parents' eyes, the one who could do no wrong. But now, without my usual support, he was left to navigate the fallout of his choices on his own. I felt a rush of satisfaction mixed with a tinge of anxiety. Would he lash out at me? Would my parents turn their anger toward me for not helping? As the table fell into an awkward silence, I could see my mother's face turning from confusion to anger, her eyes darting back and forth between David and me. "Rachel, you're just going to sit there? Don't you care about your brother?" she demanded, her voice sharp. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I care about him, but he has to take responsibility for his actions. I can't keep cleaning up his messes. It's not healthy for either of us. David's expression shifted from anger to desperation. "You really think I can handle this without your help? Come on," he pleaded, but there was no sympathy left in me. I looked him in the eye, feeling empowered. "You need to learn that your actions have consequences. I won't be your crutch anymore." The tension in the room thickened, wrapping around us like an uncomfortable blanket. My parents, realizing that their usual tactics weren't working, began to shift their strategy. "You can't just leave him to fend for himself, Rachel. He's your brother." My father chimed in, his voice a mixture of frustration and disbelief. "Family means helping each other," my mother added, her tone rising with each word. I shook my head, refusing to back down. "Family also means holding each other accountable. If you truly care about David, you should want him to learn from this. He can't just rely on me forever." As my words sank in, I noticed a flicker of uncertainty in my mother's eyes. For the first time, I felt like I was breaking through their expectations. David sat there, visibly sweating under the pressure. The laughter that had once floated around the table had evaporated, replaced by a heavy silence. I could see the realization dawning on him that his usual charm and manipulation wouldn't work this time. My heart raced, but I felt a strange sense of liberation. I was finally stepping into my own power. My parents, now on the defensive, tried to rally around David, but their words came out jumbled and incoherent. It was like watching a poorly orchestrated play fall apart on stage. They were grasping at straws, trying to find ways to get me to cave, but I stood firm. You don't understand, Rachel. He needs you. My father insisted, his voice shaking slightly. What happens if he goes to jail? You'll be the one who let him down. My mother added, her eyes wide with panic. I felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on me. But instead of crumbling, I felt empowered. I had spent too long being the reliable one, the one who always picked up the pieces. This time I was taking a different path. If he goes to jail, it's because of his choices, not mine. I won't walk that road with him anymore, I replied, my voice steady. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel the tension radiating throughout the room. My parents looked at each other, trying to gauge their next move. I could see the disappointment etched on their faces, but I didn't care. For once, I was prioritizing my own well-being over their demands. As I sat back and let the chaos unfold, I felt a sense of liberation wash over me. I didn't have to be the one who fixed everything anymore. I was tired of being the family's scapegoat, the one who always had to come to the rescue. I watched as David's bravado slowly faded, replaced by a look of confusion and fear. Without my usual support, he was floundering. I realized then that this was a pivotal moment, not just for me but for him as well. The more I stood my ground, the more I could see the cracks forming in our family's facade. David's entitlement was no longer my problem. I had finally broken free from the cycle of enabling behavior. The relief flooded through me as I recognized my own strength. No longer would I be trapped in a role that didn't serve me. I was reclaiming my life, and it felt good. I glanced around the table, taking in the stunned expressions on my family's faces. This was my moment, and I wasn't going to let it slip away. The tension in the room was thick, and I could sense the shift in dynamics. David was no longer the favored child, and my parents were struggling to adapt to this new reality. I felt lighter, unburdened by the weight of their expectations. As the night wore on, the conversation shifted, and I found myself smiling internally. I was finally stepping into my own power, and it was exhilarating. I was free, and I wouldn't let anyone take that away from me. As the night progressed, the facade began to crumble. David's attempts at humor backfired spectacularly. He tried to make light of his situation, cracking jokes about how he'd get a slap on the wrist for his reckless driving, but the laughter around the table quickly faded. My parents, who had initially been supportive of him, started to look visibly uncomfortable. They were used to me swooping in to defend him, but this time I was resolute in my silence. When my uncle pointed out the flaws in David's excuses, it became painfully clear to everyone that he was out of his depth without my help. David fumbled over his words, his bravado slipping away as he struggled to explain how he thought he could get away with such a serious offense. I watched as his confidence turned into desperation. It was a sight I had never witnessed before, and I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. You can't just laugh this off, David. You could have seriously hurt someone, my uncle said, shaking his head. The reality of the situation was finally sinking in, not just for David but for everyone around the table. My parents were caught off guard. Their usual strategy of protecting David was failing. They exchanged worried glances, and I could see the panic in their eyes. They had always believed that keeping the family image intact was more important than addressing the underlying problems. But now, with David floundering and no legal shield in sight, their defenses were crumbling. As David continued to stammer and shift in his seat, I felt a surge of empowerment. This was the moment that I needed to take a stand. I had to remind myself of all the times I had put my life on hold to save him. It had to end here. David, you seriously need to take responsibility for your actions, I finally said, my voice cutting through the tension. Everyone turned to look at me, their expressions a mix of shock and disbelief. They were not used to me speaking up like this. What do you mean? I'm your brother. You're supposed to help me. David shot back, his voice rising in panic. Helping you doesn't mean enabling your reckless behavior. You need to face the consequences of what you've done. I won't be your safety net anymore, I replied, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders as I said the words. The silence that followed was deafening. My parents looked at me with anger and confusion. Rachel, how can you say that? He's your brother, my mother exclaimed, her voice trembling. And that's precisely why I can't keep bailing him out. I care about him too much to let him think this is acceptable behavior. This time he needs to learn something, I stated firmly, refusing to back down. David's face turned a deep shade of red as he realized that the usual support system was no longer there for him. I could see the realization dawning on him that he had to face this battle alone. "You're making a huge mistake. You're going to regret this," he yelled, his frustration boiling over. I remained calm, knowing that this was the moment of truth. Their reactions were only further proof of how our family dynamics had been built on enabling, rather than accountability. I could feel my heart racing, but I stood my ground, knowing that I was finally taking control of my own life. "You can't keep making excuses for your actions. If you want to change, you need to start by owning up to what you've done," I said, feeling the words resonate not just with David but with everyone at the table. The tension in the room shifted again. My parents, caught off guard by my assertiveness, were scrambling to regain control of the situation. They had always relied on me to be the peacemaker, but now I was refusing to play that role. "You're being selfish, Rachel. You have no idea what he's going through." My father shot back, frustration etched on his face. "Selfish? Or finally taking care of myself? I've spent years being the one who cleans up after everyone else. It's time for David to face the music, and I won't be the one to shield him from it anymore," I replied, feeling emboldened by my own words. As I looked around the table, I could see my cousins exchanging glances, clearly recognizing the truth in what I was saying. I wasn't just standing up for myself. I was standing up for everyone who had been silenced in this family. The atmosphere was electric. David sat in stunned silence, and I could see the realization wash over him. This was a pivotal moment not just for me but for him as well. They had always painted me as the villain, the one who didn't support her brother. But now their anger was misplaced. They were angry because I was no longer their puppet. I was finally breaking free from the chains of their expectations. In that moment, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I had been carrying the burden of my family's dysfunction for far too long. I was tired of being the one to fix things. Now I was reclaiming my life, my choices, and my peace. As I sat back and let the chaos unfold, I felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I was no longer defined by my family's expectations. I was forging my own path, and for the first time in a long time it felt good. I watched as David struggled to regain his footing without my support. The laughter had faded, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that filled the room. In that awkward stillness I found my strength. I was ready to embrace this new chapter of my life, free from the toxic ties that had bound me for so long. As the evening wore on, it became painfully clear that David was floundering without my help. His usual charm and quick wit had vanished, replaced by a nervous energy that filled the room. With no one to save him, he struggled to defend himself against the mounting pressure from our family. I watched as his bravado slowly crumbled under the weight of the conversations around him. My uncle, always the voice of reason in our family, pointed out the flaws in David's excuses. "You can't just laugh this off, David. You could have seriously hurt someone." His voice cut through the tension, and I could see the realization dawning on everyone. David's attempts to downplay the incident only made things worse. He fumbled over his words, trying to explain how he thought he could get away with such reckless behavior. But the more he spoke, the more ridiculous he sounded. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and concern as I realized just how deep his denial ran. My parents, who had always defended him without question, looked visibly uncomfortable. They were used to me swooping in to protect him, but this time I was resolute in my silence. I had finally found my voice, and it felt liberating. The awkwardness in the room was thick, and I could sense the shift in dynamics. David, once the golden child, was now receiving the scrutiny he had long avoided. My parents exchanged worried glances, their usual tactics failing as they struggled to shield him from the consequences of his actions. When someone pointed out the clear flaws in his story, it was evident to everyone that David was out of his depth without my legal support. My heart raced as I realized this was a pivotal moment, not just for me but for him as well. He needed to face the truth, and I was finally stepping aside to let him do so. As the conversation shifted, I felt a rush of empowerment. I was no longer paralyzed by fear of being the bad guy. Instead, I was reclaiming my identity, no longer defined by my family's expectations or David's mistakes. "You can't keep making excuses for your actions. I finally said, my voice cutting through the tension once again. Everyone turned to look at me, their expressions a mix of shock and disbelief. They were not used to me speaking up like this. David shot back, "What do you mean? I'm your brother. You're supposed to help me." His panic was palpable, and I realized that he had never truly considered the implications of his actions. Helping you doesn't mean enabling your reckless behavior. You need to face the consequences of what you've done. "I won't be your safety net anymore," I replied, feeling lighter with each word I spoke. The silence that followed was deafening. My parents looked at me with anger and confusion. Their world turned upside down. "Rachel, how can you say that? He's your brother," my mother exclaimed, her voice trembling with disbelief. I could feel the pressure mounting around me, but instead of crumbling, I felt empowered. I had spent too long being the reliable one, the one who always picked up the pieces. This time I was taking a different path. Family also means holding each other accountable. If you truly care about David, you should want him to learn from this. He can't just rely on me forever, I stated firmly, refusing to back down. As I said those words, I could see a flicker of uncertainty in my mother's eyes. For the first time, I felt like I was breaking through their expectations. David sat there, visibly sweating under the pressure. The laughter had faded, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that filled the room. I could see the realization dawning on him that his usual charm and manipulation wouldn't work this time. My heart raced, but I felt a strange sense of liberation. I was finally taking a stand, and it felt good. I was reclaiming my life, and I wouldn't let anyone take that away from me. As the tension in the room thickened, my parents began to shift their strategy. They were grasping at straws, trying to find ways to get me to cave, but I stood firm. "You don't understand, Rachel. He needs you," my father insisted, his voice shaking slightly. "What happens if he goes to jail? You'll be the one who let him down," my mother added, her eyes wide with panic. I felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on me, but instead of crumbling, I felt empowered. I had spent too long being the one who cleaned up after everyone else. This time I was taking a different path. If he goes to jail, it's because of his choices, not mine. "I won't walk that road with him anymore," I replied, my voice steady. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel the tension radiating throughout the room. My parents looked at each other, trying to gauge their next move. I could see the disappointment etched on their faces, but I didn't care. For once, I was prioritizing my own well-being over their demands. As I sat back and let the chaos unfold, I felt a sense of liberation wash over me. I didn't have to be the one who fixed everything anymore. I was tired of being the family's scapegoat. I was reclaiming my life, and it felt good. The weight of their expectations no longer suffocated me. I realized I was free to forge my own path, separate from their toxic influence. David's entitlement was no longer my problem. I had finally broken free from the cycle of enabling behavior. As the night wore on, I noticed my family's attempts to rally around David were failing. Without my legal expertise to shield him, he was left to navigate the fallout of his actions on his own. My heart raced as I recognized the shift in power dynamics. In that moment, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I had been carrying the burden of my family's dysfunction for far too long. I was tired of being the one to fix things. Now I was reclaiming my life, my choices, and my peace. The silence that filled the room was both liberating and terrifying. I was finally stepping into my own power, and it was exhilarating. The chaos that surrounded me only reinforced my decision. I was ready to embrace this new chapter of my life, free from the toxic ties that had bound me for so long. In the aftermath of that chaotic dinner, I made a conscious decision to distance myself from my family. It felt like a breath of fresh air, finally able to focus on my career and mental health without the constant weight of their expectations. I stopped answering their calls, ignoring the guilt that tried to creep in. They would often reach out to drag me back into their chaos, but I stood firm. The realization that I didn't need their approval to thrive became my new mantra. I started finding joy in my work again. I took on new clients, worked late nights, and watched as my practice flourished. I even managed to secure a promotion that I had long worked for, but never thought I could achieve without my family's validation. The feeling of pride washed over me, and I realized that I was capable of success on my own terms. As the holidays approached, I felt a sense of peace rather than anxiety. I decorated my apartment, filled it with laughter from friends who truly supported me, and embraced the quiet moments. I learned to enjoy my own company, relishing the silence that had once felt so foreign. My mind was clear, free from the toxic noise that had clouded my judgment for years. Though my family still spoke ill of me, I no longer cared. Their opinions no longer defined my worth. My victory was in my self-acceptance, the knowledge that I could thrive without their toxic influence. I found solace in my independence, knowing that I was finally at peace. The silence was blissful and I was free.